In the autumn of 1347, 12 ships arrived in the Sicilian port of Messina carrying something that no harbormaster had ever seen before. The sailors aboard those ships were dying. Those who were still alive had strange black swellings, the size of eggs or apples, in their armpits and groins, oozing blood and pus. They had fevers that would not break. They vomited blood. Their skin had darkened in patches, as if something inside them was already rotting. The port authorities of Messina ordered the ships out of the harbor immediately, but it was already too late. Before the ships had even docked, whatever they were carrying had come ashore with them. Within days, people in Messina were dying with the same symptoms as the sailors. Within weeks, the disease had reached the Sicilian interior. Within months, it had crossed to the Italian mainland. Within 3 years, it would kill between a third and a half of every person alive in Europe, the most catastrophic mortality event in the history of the continent, and one of the most devastating in the history of the world. Subscribe now and never miss a documentary. Every week we travel into the events and mysteries that the history books compress into a single paragraph, into the moments that were not paragraphs but entire worlds, entire transformations of what it meant to be alive in a particular time and place. We call it the Black Death, though the people who lived through it use different names: the Great Pestilence, the Great Mortality, the Universal Plague. The name Black Death did not come into common use until centuries later. But the experience it describes was immediate and overwhelming. A disease that arrived without warning, spread faster than any rumor could travel, killed with a speed and an efficiency that seemed to belong not to the natural world but to some supernatural judgment, and left behind a Europe so depopulated, so changed in its social structures and its intellectual frameworks and its relationship to death and to God, that historians have debated ever since whether the plague ended the medieval world and began the modern one. Tonight we follow the path of the Black Death, where it came from, how it spread, what it did to the bodies and minds of those it reached, and what it left behind when, finally and incompletely, it withdrew. This is the story of 3 years that changed everything. To enter fully into the experience of the Black Death requires an act of imagination that is difficult but necessary. The people of 14th century Europe had no equivalent to our public health framework. They had no germ theory, no concept of the flea vector, no antibiotics. What they had was prayer, flight, and the desperate application of the only medical theory they possessed, and none of it worked. Understanding the Black Death means understanding what it felt like to be alive where the death of half the people you knew was not a historical abstraction but a daily reality, where you had watched your parents or your children die of something you could not explain and could not stop, and where you had no way of knowing whether you would be alive tomorrow. The ships from the Crimea that arrived in Messina were not unusual ships. They were Genoese merchant vessels, the kind that had been moving between the Black Sea ports and the Mediterranean for decades, carrying grain, silk, furs, spices, and the other goods of the enormous Mongol organized trade networks that connected China to the Atlantic world. The 14th century was, before the plague, a period of remarkable commercial connectivity, a globalization avant la lettre in which goods and people and ideas moved across the breadth of the Eurasian continent with a regularity and a speed that would not be seen again until the modern era. The Silk Road, maintained and expanded by the Mongol Empire across the 13th and early 14th centuries, had made the trade routes of Central Asia more secure than they had been since the height of the Roman Empire. Genoese and Venetian merchants had established trading colonies on the Black Sea coast, at the far eastern end of the Mediterranean commercial world, where they bought the goods brought overland from China and Persia and India. Those trading colonies, and the ships that connected them to the markets of Western Europe, were also the mechanism by which the plague moved from its Central Asian reservoir to the Mediterranean world and thence to the rest of Europe. The autumn of 1347, when the Messina ships arrived, was not the first time that the plague had struck. The memory of the Justinianic plague had faded from active consciousness by the 14th century. Too many generations had passed for it to function as a living warning, but the biological reality of Yersinia pestis had not changed in those 8 centuries, and neither had the vulnerability of dense human populations to its assault. The Justinianic plague of the 6th and 7th centuries, named for the Byzantine Emperor Justinian who ruled when it began, had swept through the Mediterranean world and beyond, killing perhaps 25 million people and weakening the Byzantine Empire at a crucial moment in its struggle with the newly emergent Islamic caliphates. That first pandemic had eventually faded, leaving reservoirs of the bacterium in rodent populations across Eurasia, but not sustaining itself in human populations. The reasons for its retreat and for the long interval before the second pandemic are not fully understood, but the return of the plague in the 14th century was not unprecedented. It was the resumption of something that had happened before, in a world that had largely forgotten that it could happen. The disease that devastated Europe between 1347 and 1351 was caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, a microorganism that was identified and named in 1894 by the Swiss-French bacteriologist Alexander Yersin, working in Hong Kong during the Third Great Plague pandemic of the modern era. Yersinia pestis is a gram-negative bacterium that lives primarily in rodents, particularly in the burrowing rodents of the Central Asian steppe, where it has circulated in animal populations for thousands of years, maintained by fleas that move between rodent hosts and occasionally transfer the infection to other mammals, including humans. The natural reservoir of the bacterium is not rats but the burrowing rodents of the Eurasian interior. Marmots, voles, ground squirrels, and related species that live in large colonies in the grasslands of what is now Kazakhstan, Mongolia, and the surrounding regions. In these animal populations, Yersinia pestis is what epidemiologists call enzootic. It circulates continuously, causing periodic die-offs among the rodent hosts but persisting in the population because some individuals survive and carry the bacterium through to the next generation. The mechanism of transmission to humans involves a chain of events that begins with a flea. The oriental rat flea, Xenocilla chiopes, is the most important vector. It feeds on the blood of infected rodents, ingests the bacterium, and when the rodent host dies, it seeks a new host. If that new host is a human, the flea's feeding transmits the bacterium into the bloodstream, where it multiplies rapidly and invades the lymphatic system. The bacteria concentrate in the lymph nodes nearest to the flea bite, usually in the groin, the armpit, or the neck, where the immune system mounts a desperate and usually futile defense. The result is the bubo, the swollen, darkened, agonizing lymph node that gave bubonic plague its name, and that was the most visible and most feared symptom of the disease to medieval observers. Bubonic plague, if untreated, kills between 30 and 60% of those infected, typically within 3 to 7 days of the appearance of symptoms. But Yersinia pestis has 2 other forms that are even more lethal. Septicemic plague occurs when the bacterium enters the bloodstream directly, overwhelming the immune system before the characteristic buboes can form. It kills essentially all of those it infects, usually within 24 hours. And pneumonic plague, the form that develops when the bacterium reaches the lungs, either through the bloodstream or through inhalation of respiratory droplets from an infected person, is almost universally fatal and is directly transmissible from person to person through the air. It was almost certainly the pneumonic form of the plague that accounted for much of the explosive spread observed in 1347 to 1351, when the disease moved through densely populated medieval cities with a speed that flea-borne transmission alone cannot fully explain. The symptoms of bubonic plague, as described by medieval observers who witnessed them firsthand, were specific enough that modern physicians can recognize them unambiguously from the historical descriptions. The buboes, the swollen lymph nodes, appeared first, within 2 or 3 days of infection, typically in the groin or the armpit or the neck, depending on where the flea had bitten. They were extremely painful, hot to the touch, and grew rapidly from the size of a walnut to the size of an apple. The skin over them darkened as the blood vessels beneath ruptured. Simultaneously, the victim developed a high fever, severe headache, weakness, and disorientation. In most cases, the bubo would not drain. The contents would remain within the swollen node, and the infection would spread from the lymph nodes into the bloodstream, causing septicemia. In the final stages, the victim might develop gangrene in the extremities, the fingers, toes, and nose turning black as the blood supply failed, which gave the disease its later popular name. The average time from the appearance of buboes to death was between 3 and 5 days. There was no effective treatment. The physician could drain the bubo, which sometimes relieved the pain and occasionally allowed the immune system to overwhelm the infection, but more often simply hastened the spread. Most people who developed buboes died. And because the disease was most likely also spreading pneumonically, through the breath of the sick, even people who had never been bitten by a flea could be infected simply by being in the same room as someone already ill. The survival rates varied considerably depending on the form of the disease and, to some extent, on the circumstances of the individual. A small number of people who developed bubonic plague did survive, perhaps 30 to 40%, in populations with no effective treatment. These survivors were not immune to future infection, but they may have had some partial immunity that reduced their vulnerability to subsequent exposures. Whether there was genuine genetic variation in susceptibility to Yersinia pestis, whether some people were constitutionally more resistant to the infection, is a question that modern genetics is beginning to address, with evidence suggesting that variants in certain immune genes did provide meaningful protection. But in the context of the 14th century epidemic, these individual differences were statistical whispers against a roar of mortality. Whole families died, whole neighborhoods, whole villages, with a thoroughness that made the survivors feel not so much lucky as arbitrarily selected, as if death had moved through their community with no principle of selection they could discern. The theological question, "Why did God spare me and not my neighbor?" had no answer, and the unanswerability of that question was one of the deepest wounds the plague inflicted on the medieval Christian world. The origins of the Black Death, where it began, how it reached the Crimea and the Mediterranean ports from which it spread across Europe, have been debated by historians and scientists for decades, and the question has only recently been resolved to a reasonable degree of scholarly consensus. The traditional account, which dates from near-contemporary medieval sources, placed the origin of the plague in Central Asia, in the lands of the Mongol Empire, in the steppes east of the Black Sea. A Flemish chronicler writing in the 1340s described reports of a catastrophic epidemic in the east that had devastated entire regions before reaching the Mediterranean. The Mongol world that connected China to the Black Sea coast had, in the preceding decades, experienced its own plague mortality that historians have attempted to reconstruct from fragmentary sources. A cemetery at Issyk-Kul in what is now Kyrgyzstan, excavated in the 19th century, contained headstones from the 1340s with inscriptions noting that the dead had died of pestilence, suggesting that the epidemic was striking the Central Asian steppe population years before it reached Europe. The mechanism by which the plague reached the Black Sea ports from which it then spread to the Mediterranean has been preserved in a remarkable account by the Italian notary Gabriele de Mussi. He described the siege of Kaffa, the Genoese trading colony on the Crimean coast, modern Feodosia, by the forces of the Golden Horde under the Khan Yani Beg. During the siege in 1346, the Mongol army was struck by the plague, and, according to de Mussi, the Mongols catapulted the bodies of their dead over the walls of Kaffa into the besieged city, deliberately using the corpses as biological weapons. The Genoese merchants in Kaffa, themselves then infected, fled the city by ship and carried the disease to Constantinople, to Sicily, to Genoa, to Marseille, to the ports from which it would spread across the entirety of Europe. Modern genetic research has confirmed and refined this account in remarkable ways. Analysis of ancient DNA extracted from the teeth of plague victims buried in medieval cemeteries across Europe has allowed scientists to reconstruct the genome of the 14th century plague bacterium with considerable precision. Those analyses have confirmed that all the European strains of the Black Death plague are closely related. consistent with a single introduction into Europe that then spread rapidly, and that they share a common ancestor with strains still circulating in modern plague reservoirs in Central Asia, specifically in the Tian Shan region of Kyrgyzstan. The cemetery at Issyk-Kul has been re-examined with modern techniques, and the ancient DNA from its burials has been shown to be closely related to the ancestral strain of the European Black Death. The genetic evidence places the origin of the 14th century pandemic with remarkable precision. A specific valley in the mountains of what is now Kyrgyzstan in the 1340s, where a change in the relationship between the bacterium and its animal reservoir triggered an expansion that would ultimately reach every corner of the known world. The route the plague took from that Central Asian origin to the Crimean coast, the path that brought it to the Genoese trading colony of Kaffa and thence to the Mediterranean, followed the trade routes of the Mongol Empire. This is one of the great ironies of medieval history. The same infrastructure that had made the 14th century's remarkable economic connectivity possible, the Pax Mongolica, the enforced peace across the Eurasian steppe that allowed merchants to travel safely from China to the Black Sea, was also the infrastructure along which the plague traveled. The roads that had opened the Silk Road to commerce also opened it to contagion. The caravanserais where merchants rested also harbored the rats and fleas that carried the bacterium. The ships that brought the wealth of the East to the markets of the West also brought, in the autumn of 1347, the most lethal pathogen that the Western world had encountered in 8 centuries. The Mongol Empire itself was among the plague's early victims. The Golden Horde, the Mongol successor state that controlled the Pontic steppe and the northern Black Sea coast, was struck by the plague in the mid-1340s, and the epidemic may have contributed to the political instability that weakened Mongol power in the subsequent decades. The siege of Kaffa, in which the Mongol forces allegedly catapulted plague-infected corpses over the walls, was itself partly a consequence of the plague's devastation of the besieging army. The Mongols were throwing bodies they could not otherwise dispose of, their troops dying faster than they could be buried. The biological weapon, if it was that, was evidence of desperation as much as of deliberate strategy. And whether or not the catapulted corpses actually infected the Genoese in Kaffa, the evidence for this mechanism of transmission is historically plausible but scientifically somewhat uncertain. The plague was already moving along the trade routes of the Black Sea coast, and Kaffa's fate would have been similar regardless of what the Mongols catapulted over its walls. The speed with which the Black Death moved across Europe was unlike anything the continent's inhabitants had ever experienced, and it remains one of the most remarkable epidemiological events in recorded history. The disease reached Sicily in the autumn of 1347. By the spring of 1348, it had spread to mainland Italy and was devastating the great cities of Florence, Venice, Genoa, and Pisa. By the summer of 1348, it had crossed the Alps into France, reached Paris, and was advancing into Spain. By the autumn of 1348, it had reached England, crossing the Channel to the port of Weymouth and then spreading northward through the country. By 1349, it had reached Germany, Austria, and the Low Countries. By 1350, it had penetrated Scandinavia, arriving in Norway on a ship whose entire crew had died at sea, the vessel drifting into the harbor at Bergen with no one left alive to bring it to dock. By 1351, it had crossed into Russia and was advancing toward the east, completing a circuit that had brought it from Central Asia to the Atlantic coast and back again within the space of a few years. The mortality figures, where they can be established from contemporary records, are staggering. Florence lost between 60 and 75% of its population between 1348 and 1350. Venice lost at least 60%. Hamburg lost approximately 60%. Paris, with a population of perhaps 200,000 before the plague, lost roughly half its inhabitants. In England, the best current estimates suggest that between 40 and 60% of the entire population died. Some villages in England were so thoroughly depopulated that they were simply abandoned. The sites of these lost medieval villages are still identifiable today from aerial photographs, their earthwork traces visible in fields that have been farmed over them for 600 years. In total, the Black Death is estimated to have killed between 75 and 200 million people worldwide, with most historians now placing the European death toll at approximately half the pre-plague population, or somewhere between 25 and 50 million people. The clergy were among the hardest hit of all professional groups. Because priests were expected to minister to the sick and dying, to administer last rites, to pray over the bodies of the dead, they were exposed to the plague with a frequency that almost no other occupational group could match. In some dioceses, the death rates among the clergy were even higher than the already catastrophic rates in the general population. The Diocese of Barcelona lost perhaps half its clergy. Many English dioceses reported similar losses. The practical consequence was a severe shortage of priests that the institutional church struggled to address, ordaining men who were not yet canonically qualified, relaxing standards that had been maintained for centuries, accepting into holy orders candidates who would not have been admitted in ordinary times. The quality of the clergy that emerged from the plague years was, in many areas, significantly lower than it had been before. Less educated, less trained, less able to provide the intellectual and spiritual leadership that the Church had previously offered. This degradation of clerical quality contributed to the anti-clericalism and calls for church reform that intensified throughout the late 14th and 15th centuries, eventually feeding into the Reformation. The specific trajectory of the plague as it moved through England has been reconstructed with remarkable precision from the records of episcopal registers, the administrative records kept by bishops that documented, among other things, the appointment of clergy to vacant parish positions. When a parish priest died, the bishop had to appoint a replacement, and the frequency of those appointments in the plague years provides a proxy measure for mortality that is more systematic and reliable than most medieval mortality data. The analysis of these registers shows the plague moving through England in a wave, arriving in the southwest in the summer of 1348 and advancing northward through the country over the following year. It reached East Anglia and the Midlands by the autumn of 1348, London by November, and the north of England by the spring and summer of 1349. The wave left devastation at every point it touched, and in many parishes, the records show 3, 4, or 5 successive appointments within a single year as each new priest died and had to be replaced. The experience of living through that mortality was something that medieval sources record with a mixture of precision and horror. Giovanni Boccaccio, who survived the Florence plague of 1348 and used it as the framing device for his Decameron, described the abandonment of social bonds that the disease produced: parents abandoning children, children abandoning parents, neighbors refusing to help neighbors, the ordinary fabric of human mutual obligation dissolving under the pressure of fear and survival. The dead could not always be buried with proper ceremony because the living were too few, too exhausted, or too frightened to perform the rites. Massive communal graves were dug at the edges of cities, and bodies were thrown in without individual identification or prayer. The relationship between the living and the dead, which in medieval European culture was governed by elaborate rituals of mourning, burial, and commemoration, was disrupted on a scale that had never been seen before and has rarely been seen since. The medical understanding of the Black Death available to medieval physicians and scholars was almost entirely useless for preventing or treating the disease, and the attempts to explain it produced some of the most dramatic intellectual failures in the history of medicine. The dominant medical tradition in 14th century Europe was the humoral theory inherited from classical antiquity, the idea that health consisted of a balance among 4 bodily fluids, or humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Disease was understood as an imbalance of these humors, and treatment consisted of restoring balance through diet, purging, bloodletting, and the application of various herbs and substances. The humoral framework had no category for infectious disease in the modern sense, no concept of contagion through invisible particles or organisms, no understanding of the relationship between the rat flea and the human lymph node. When the plague arrived, physicians trained in the humoral tradition struggled to fit it into their existing framework, with results that ranged from the merely ineffective to the actively harmful. The official explanation produced by the medical faculty of the University of Paris in 1348, at the request of the French King Philip VI, identified the cause of the plague as a conjunction of the planets Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars in the sign of Aquarius on March 20, 1345. This astrological alignment, the Paris physicians argued, had produced a corruption of the air, a miasma, that was the proximate cause of the disease. The treatment they recommended followed logically from this diagnosis. Avoid the corrupted air, which meant staying indoors, avoiding night air, and burning aromatic substances to purify the air in one's home. These measures were useless against a flea-borne bacterial infection, and in some cases, crowding more people into enclosed spaces to avoid the miasmatic air, they may have made transmission worse. The theory of miasma, that disease was spread through corrupted air, was not entirely without observational support. Medieval observers noted correctly that the plague was more prevalent in low-lying, marshy areas and in crowded urban environments, and the miasma theory provided a plausible explanation for both observations. What it could not explain was why the disease spread along trade routes, why it moved from port to port, why it was associated with the movements of people and goods. A few medieval thinkers moved toward something like a contagion theory, the idea that the disease was transmitted through contact with the sick or with their belongings. Guidance to avoid contact with the plague-stricken was issued in some cities, and the practice of quarantine, holding ships and travelers for a period before allowing them into port, was developed in response to the Black Death, representing one of the most important public health innovations in the history of medicine. But the underlying mechanism remained completely unknown, and would remain so until the germ theory of disease was established in the 19th century. The physicians who did try to treat the plague showed considerable courage in doing so, even if their treatments were useless or worse. Many doctors stayed at their posts when they could have fled, visiting the sick and trying the remedies their training had given them: bloodletting, lancing the buboes, applying poultices, prescribing herbal preparations. Some of these interventions may have provided marginal comfort. None of them could address the bacterial infection underlying the disease. A striking number of physicians died of plague themselves, an occupational hazard that was obvious to everyone and that did nothing to deter those who took their professional obligations seriously. Medieval medical ethics, drawing on the Hippocratic tradition, emphasized the duty to treat the sick even at personal risk, and many physicians honored that obligation at the cost of their lives. The figure of the plague doctor, wearing a long waxed coat and a beak-shaped mask filled with aromatic herbs, became one of the iconic images of the plague era. The beak mask was actually developed in the 17th century, not during the Black Death itself, but the image has become so inseparable from the plague in popular imagination that it is worth noting what it represents: a genuine attempt to develop protective equipment against an incompletely understood disease. The aromatic herbs in the beak provided no protection against flea bites, and the waxed coat was far from a reliable barrier. The plague doctor was a figure of both courage and futility, working with tools that could not address what he did not know existed. The plague also produced early attempts to understand contagion, the idea that disease could spread from person to person through some mechanism of transmission, not merely through corrupted air. The Florentine chronicler Giovanni Villani noted that the plague seemed to move from person to person through direct contact. The Catalan physician Jacques d'Agremont, writing in 1348, distinguished between different modes of transmission and recognized that some form of contact with the sick seemed to be involved in the spread of the disease. These observations did not produce a correct theory of contagion that would require the development of germ theory 5 centuries later, but they represented a genuine empirical engagement with the patterns of disease spread that was more sophisticated than pure miasma theory. The 14th century was, in this limited sense, the beginning of epidemiology, the observational science of how disease moves through populations. The tools were rudimentary and the theoretical framework was wrong, but the impulse to watch carefully, to record what was observed, and to draw conclusions from the patterns was genuinely scientific, and it was driven by the urgency of watching the world die. The religious response to the Black Death was as varied and as desperate as the medical response, and it produced some of the most extraordinary scenes in the history of European Christianity. The dominant theological interpretation of the plague was that it was a punishment sent by God for the sins of humanity, a divine chastisement of the kind described in the Old Testament, when God had sent plagues upon Egypt and upon the Israelites themselves. That interpretation was almost universal among medieval Christians, and it shaped the responses of individuals, communities, and institutions in profound ways. If the plague was God's punishment, then the appropriate response was penitence, the acknowledgement of sin, the performance of rituals of atonement, the supplication of divine mercy. Prayer, fasting, processions, and the veneration of saints associated with plague protection, particularly Saint Sebastian, who had been martyred by arrows and whose pierced body was associated with the penetrating symptoms of the disease, and Saint Roch, who had himself survived the plague, became central features of civic religious life across Europe. The flagellant movement, which appeared in Germany and the Low Countries in 1348 and spread rapidly across Europe, took the logic of penitence to its extreme. The flagellants, also known as the Brethren of the Cross, were groups of lay people who traveled from town to town performing public rituals of self-flagellation, beating themselves with leather whips studded with metal spikes, drawing blood as a demonstration of penitence and an attempt to participate in the suffering of Christ. At the peak of the movement in 1349 and 1350, groups of flagellants were moving through towns across Germany, the Low Countries, France, and as far east as Poland, performing their rituals in public squares before large crowds. The movement was eventually condemned and suppressed by the papacy, which recognized in it a dangerous tendency toward lay religious authority and the bypassing of the institutional church. But in the desperate years of the plague, it drew large numbers of people who were willing to undergo physical suffering in the hope of appeasing the divine wrath they believed was being visited upon them. The plague also produced one of the most virulent and destructive episodes of anti-Semitism in European history. The conspiracy theory that Jews had caused the Black Death by poisoning wells spread rapidly through Germany and the Rhineland in 1348 and 1349, despite the fact that Jewish communities were dying of the plague at the same rate as Christian communities. The theory was absurd. Well poisoning could not explain the pattern of plague spread, and Yersinia pestis kills without regard to religion, but it provided an outlet for the fear and grief and rage of communities that were watching half their neighbors die and had no rational explanation for why. Massacres of Jewish communities occurred across the Rhineland and beyond. In Strasbourg, in Mainz, in Cologne, in hundreds of smaller towns. Thousands of Jews were killed, burned alive, hanged, or drowned, in a wave of violence that the Pope condemned and local authorities were often unable or unwilling to stop. Some Jewish communities were destroyed entirely. The Black Death pogrom of 1348 to 1349 was one of the worst episodes of mass violence against Jewish communities in European history before the 20th century. The geography of the anti-Jewish violence is instructive. It was concentrated in the German-speaking lands, the Holy Roman Empire, and was largely absent from England, where Jews had been expelled in 1290, and from Italy, where local authorities and the Jewish community's own demographic weight gave them somewhat more protection. In Strasbourg, the Jewish community was burned alive in February 1349, before the plague had even reached the city, demonstrating that the accusation of well poisoning was serving as a pretext for violence that had been incubating independently of the actual disease. In Mainz, one of the largest Jewish communities in medieval Europe, thousands were killed. In Cologne, the community was destroyed. Pope Clement VI issued 2 papal bulls condemning the pogroms and pointing out, correctly, that Jews were dying of the plague at the same rate as Christians, that a people accused of spreading the disease could hardly be immune to it themselves. His condemnations were ignored by the local populations and often by the local authorities who were supposed to enforce order. The Black Death pogroms accelerated the eastward migration of European Jewish communities that had been underway since the earlier persecutions of the Crusade era. Many surviving German Jews fled eastward to Poland and Lithuania, where King Casimir the Great had issued charters guaranteeing Jewish rights and where the relatively underdeveloped economy offered opportunities for the commercial skills that the Jewish communities had developed over centuries of exclusion from land ownership and the guild system. The Jewish communities of Poland and Eastern Europe that would become so central to the cultural and intellectual life of the region in subsequent centuries were built, in significant part, by refugees from the Black Death persecutions in the West, a demographic consequence of the plague's violence that would itself have enormous historical consequences in the centuries that followed. The social and economic consequences of the Black Death were as transformative as its direct mortality, and in some ways, the changes it produced were as important as the deaths themselves in reshaping the world that emerged from the catastrophe. The most immediate economic consequence was the collapse of labor supply. In a pre-industrial economy, human labor is the fundamental productive resource. It grows the food, builds the buildings, transports the goods, works the crafts. When half the workforce dies within 3 years, the effects are felt immediately and profoundly. Agricultural production collapsed in the years immediately following the plague, not because the land had become less fertile but because there were not enough people left to work it. Fields that had been cultivated for centuries were abandoned. Livestock went untended. Harvests failed not because of weather but because the harvesters were dead. The scarcity of labor produced, paradoxically, an improvement in the material conditions of those who survived. When workers are scarce, their labor is valuable, and in the decades following the Black Death, wages rose dramatically across Europe. Peasants who had been bound to the land under the feudal system, serfs who owed labor services to their lords and who could not leave the manor without permission, found that their lords could not easily enforce those obligations when there were not enough people to work the fields and lords were competing for labor. The Black Death struck a decisive blow against serfdom in Western Europe, not because anyone intended it to, but because the simple arithmetic of supply and demand undermined the coercive power of the old system. Peasants demanded higher wages, better conditions, and more freedom of movement. And in many cases, they got them, because the alternative was no labor at all. The aristocracy and the church, which owned the land and depended on peasant labor, responded with legislation intended to cap wages and reimpose the old obligations. In England, the Statute of Labourers of 1351 attempted to fix wages at pre-plague levels and require agricultural labourers to accept work at the old rates. The statute was widely resisted and often unenforceable. The tension between the demands of the surviving peasantry and the attempts of the landowning class to restore the old order eventually exploded in the Peasants' Revolt of 1381 in England, and in similar uprisings across France and elsewhere in the late 14th century. The Black Death did not by itself produce those revolts. Other factors were involved, but it fundamentally changed the relationship between labor and capital, between the landowners and the people who worked their land, in ways that made the old order harder to maintain and the new one harder to define. The Peasants' Revolt of 1381, which brought a rebel army to the gates of London, drew directly on the social changes the plague had set in motion. The rebels demanded the abolition of serfdom, the right to rent land freely, and an end to the poll taxes imposed to finance the 100 Years' War. King Richard II met the rebel leaders at Smithfield, made promises he subsequently broke, and the revolt was suppressed, its leader Wat Tyler killed at the meeting. But the revolt demonstrated that the old certainties of the feudal order were gone. The surviving peasantry had a new consciousness of their collective power, born in the years after the plague when the sudden scarcity of labor had given them an economic leverage they had never possessed before. The longer-term economic consequences of the Black Death contributed to the dissolution of the manor system and the development of a more market-oriented rural economy across much of northwestern Europe. This transition was not smooth or uniform. It was contested, sometimes violently, and it proceeded very differently in different regions, but its direction was set by the demographic disruption of the plague, and its consequences shaped the economic trajectory of European civilization for centuries. The craft guilds were also transformed by the plague. The associations of craftsmen that controlled access to particular trades, organized around a stable hierarchy of masters, journeymen, and apprentices, were disrupted when the plague killed masters and journeymen at the same rate as the rest of the population. Guilds were forced to accept journeymen as masters before completing the traditional period of service. Standards for admission were lowered. In some trades, the shortage of skilled labor allowed craftsmen to demand wages and conditions that the guild system had previously constrained. The guilds survived, but they emerged weakened, less able to enforce their monopolies, less able to control wages and prices. That weakening was one of the many cumulative changes that contributed to the more fluid and competitive economic system that emerged in Western Europe over the following century. As serfdom weakened and wage labor became more prevalent, the relationship between lord and peasant shifted from one of personal obligation enforced by legal and physical coercion to one of economic exchange negotiated in a labor market. That shift was not completed in a generation. It took centuries, and it proceeded very unevenly across Europe, with serfdom persisting in Eastern Europe until the 19th century. But the direction of change was set by the demographic and economic disruptions of the Black Death, and historians who trace the origins of the capitalist economy that would eventually transform the entire world can find some of its roots in the labor markets that emerged from the ruins of the feudal system in the plague-devastated countryside of 14th century Europe. The intellectual and cultural responses to the Black Death were as complex and as lasting as the social and economic ones, and they left traces in European art, literature, and thought that are still visible today. The obsession with death that pervades late medieval European culture, the danse macabre, the memento mori, the skeletal figures of death that appear in paintings, sculptures, and woodcuts from the late 14th century onward, is directly connected to the experience of the Black Death and the recurrent plague episodes that followed it. Before the plague, death was certainly present in medieval European consciousness. The Christian tradition offered elaborate frameworks for thinking about mortality, salvation, and the afterlife, but it was a death that arrived individually, that could be prepared for, that took place within a social context of last rites and prayers and the company of the dying person's community. The plague death was different. Sudden, grotesque, stripping away the social and religious context that had given death its meaning, producing corpses that could not be individually buried or properly mourned. The art that emerged from that experience reflects it. Death as a leveler, as a dancer who takes the hand of pope and peasant alike, as a figure that no human preparation or social status can ward off. Giovanni Boccaccio's Decameron, written in the immediate aftermath of the Florence plague, is one of the most important literary works to emerge from the Black Death experience. The frame narrative, a group of young Florentines retreating to a country villa to escape the plague and entertaining each other with stories, uses the disaster as a kind of reset, a clearing away of the old moral order that allows the characters to explore a new one, more human, more sensual, more skeptical of clerical authority and social pretension than the world that preceded the plague. The Decameron is not a work of despair but of resilience, an assertion that human creativity and sociality survive even the worst catastrophes, but it is deeply marked by the experience of mass death, and the world it imagines is different from the world that existed before. The Black Death also accelerated a long-term shift in the intellectual culture of Europe that historians associate with the transition from the medieval to the early modern period. The plague devastated the institutional church and the learned professions, the clergy and the educated classes who staffed the universities and the cathedral schools. It produced a crisis of faith in the theological frameworks that had organized medieval intellectual life, because those frameworks could not explain why God would allow such indiscriminate destruction. The survivors needed new frameworks, new ways of thinking about human life, human dignity, and the relationship between the individual and the divine, and the search for those frameworks contributed to the intellectual movements of the 15th century that would eventually produce the Renaissance and the Reformation. The Black Death did not cause the Renaissance, but it may have created some of the conditions: the collapse of established authority, the desperate search for new meaning, the revaluation of human life that made the Renaissance possible. The visual arts provide some of the most direct evidence of the plague's cultural impact. The danse macabre, the dance of death, appeared as an artistic theme in the decades immediately following the Black Death, initially in wall paintings in churches and charnel houses, and rapidly becoming one of the dominant visual themes of the late medieval period. In the typical danse macabre composition, skeletal figures of death are shown leading people of all social ranks, pope and emperor, bishop and merchant, peasant and knight, in an unavoidable dance toward the grave. The moral message was explicit. Death is universal. It comes for everyone regardless of rank or wealth or piety, and the social hierarchies that organize the living world are meaningless in the face of it. That message was not new. Christianity had always taught the equality of all souls before God, but the Black Death had given it an urgency and a specificity that it had not previously possessed. The danse macabre was not a theological abstraction. It was a memory, a record of what had actually happened when the plague swept through a city and killed half its inhabitants without regard to their status or their virtue. The triumph of death, a theme in which death, personified as a skeletal figure riding a pale horse or driving a cart loaded with corpses, overwhelms the living world, became another major artistic theme of the post-plague period. The famous fresco in the Camposanto of Pisa, painted in the decades after the Black Death, depicts a hunting party of aristocrats encountering 3 coffins containing rotting corpses, a vivid reminder of the inevitability of death that would have carried a very different emotional charge for viewers who had lived through the plague than for those who knew it only from religious instruction. The art of the late medieval period is saturated with death in a way that distinguishes it sharply from the art of the preceding century, and that saturation reflects directly the experience of a society that had watched half its members die within 3 years. The plague did not end in 1351. It returned again and again for the next 3 centuries, a recurring presence in European life that shaped everything from urban planning to the development of public health institutions to the relationship between people and their governments. The second outbreak, in 1361, was particularly severe. Called the Pestis Secunda, or the Second Pestilence, it struck a population that had partially recovered from the first wave, but that had not developed the kind of immunity that might have protected them. This second wave was especially deadly among children, the generation born after the first plague who had never been exposed, and it has been estimated to have killed between 15 and 20% of the population, in addition to the losses already sustained in the first wave. Subsequent outbreaks in 1369, 1374, 1382, and at irregular intervals throughout the late 14th and 15th centuries kept the European population below its pre-plague levels for more than a century. The population of England, which may have been around 6 million before the Black Death, did not recover to that level until the 16th century. The recurrence of plague transformed the relationship between European cities and disease in ways that had lasting consequences for the development of public health as an institutional practice. The Venetian system of quarantine, originally 40 days of isolation for ships and travelers arriving from plague-affected regions, whose duration gave the practice its name, from the Italian quarantina meaning 40-day period, was refined and extended in the decades following the Black Death into the first systematic public health infrastructure in European history. Lazarettos, isolation hospitals for plague cases and those who had been exposed, were established in Venice, Ragusa, and other Italian cities. Boards of health were established in Italian city-states to monitor the spread of disease, regulate commerce and movement during outbreaks, and coordinate public health responses. These institutions were the direct ancestors of modern public health bureaucracies, and they represented a genuinely new way of thinking about the relationship between government and the health of the population. One that had not existed before the Black Death made it urgently necessary. The development of quarantine and public health institutions was, in this sense, one of the most important and lasting legacies of the Black Death. more important, in some respects, than the immediate mortality, because it established institutional frameworks that would protect European populations from subsequent epidemics, contribute to the eventual containment of plague, and ultimately shape the global public health infrastructure that exists today. The Black Death was not only a catastrophe but also, in a deeply ironic way, a teacher, forcing European civilization to develop responses to epidemic disease that would eventually give it tools to fight not just plague but many other infectious diseases. The city of Ragusa, modern Dubrovnik on the Croatian coast, established what is generally regarded as the first formal quarantine system in 1377, requiring all ships arriving from plague-affected areas to anchor offshore for 30 days before their passengers and cargo were allowed ashore. Venice extended and formalized this system in the early 15th century, establishing the 40-day period that gave the practice its name and creating the first dedicated lazaretto, isolation hospital, on an island in the Venetian lagoon. These institutions were remarkably sophisticated. The Venetian lazaretto had separate wards for the confirmed sick and the merely exposed, protocols for disinfecting goods, and procedures for burning the belongings of those who died in isolation. None of these measures was based on a correct understanding of how plague was transmitted. The role of the flea and the rat was unknown, but they were effective enough to slow the spread of subsequent outbreaks significantly, establishing the principle that the state had the authority and the responsibility to restrict individual freedom of movement in the interest of public health. The development of public health bureaucracy in the Italian city-states also produced innovations in the gathering and analysis of demographic data that would prove enormously consequential for the future. The bills of mortality, systematic records of deaths and their causes, published regularly so that citizens could monitor the state of epidemic disease in their cities, were a direct response to the experience of the Black Death. The knowledge that plague was coming, and roughly how fast, allowed authorities to implement quarantine measures more quickly and individuals to decide whether to stay or flee. The data produced by these mortality records also provided the raw material for the first quantitative analyses of human population dynamics, contributing to the development of demography and actuarial science as disciplines. The intellectual tools that would eventually allow modern epidemiologists to track and model the spread of infectious diseases were forged, in their earliest form, in the crucible of the plague years. The question of why the Black Death struck with such particular ferocity in the 14th century, why it killed such an extraordinary proportion of the population when plague bacteria had been present in Central Asian rodent populations for millennia, is one that modern science has only recently begun to answer. Part of the explanation lies in the state of the European population on the eve of the plague. The 13th century had been, by medieval standards, a period of exceptional prosperity and population growth. The warm medieval climate optimum, a period of slightly warmer and more stable temperatures that had prevailed across Europe from roughly 950 to 1250 CE, had allowed the cultivation of marginal lands, supported larger harvests, and permitted the expansion of the European population to levels that had never been reached before. By the early 14th century, the population of Europe may have been close to the maximum that the agricultural technology of the time could support. Then, beginning in 1315, everything changed. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1322, caused by a series of wet and cold summers that destroyed harvests across northern Europe, killed millions of people and left the survivors weakened and malnourished. The famine was followed by the outbreak of the Great Bovine Pestilence, an epidemic that killed most of the cattle in northern Europe between 1319 and 1321, eliminating a crucial source of food and draft power. By the time the Black Death arrived in 1347, the European population had already been weakened by decades of malnutrition and disease. Immune systems compromised by years of inadequate nutrition were less able to mount effective responses to a new pathogen. Bodies already weakened by the aftermath of famine were more vulnerable to the rapid bacterial infection that Yersinia pestis produced. The climate was also changing. The warm medieval optimum had given way, by the early 14th century, to a period of cooling and increased climate instability now known as the Little Ice Age. The changing climate disrupted the agricultural systems that had fed the expanding European population, contributing to the famines and the population stress that made the continent so vulnerable to the plague when it arrived. The Black Death, in this sense, was not simply an isolated epidemiological event but the catastrophic peak of a crisis that had been building for decades, a crisis of overpopulation, climate change, famine, and institutional stress that the plague finally resolved in the most brutal possible way. The intersection of climate change, famine, and epidemic disease in the first half of the 14th century is one of the clearest historical examples of a phenomenon that modern researchers call a synchronous crisis, a situation in which multiple stressors interact and amplify each other in ways that produce outcomes far worse than any single stressor would produce alone. The cold and wet summers that caused the Great Famine of 1315 to 1322 also killed the livestock that provided both food and draft power for agriculture, making it harder to recover when the weather improved. The malnutrition that resulted from the famine weakened immune systems across the population, making the recovery slower and the population more vulnerable to subsequent disease. The demographic and institutional stresses produced by the famine undermined the social cohesion and the economic resilience that might have allowed more effective responses to subsequent crises. And then the plague arrived, striking a population already weakened by 30 years of crop failures, famines, and epidemics, and killing with a ferocity that a well-nourished and well-governed population might have, marginally, been better able to resist. The parallel with modern discussions of pandemic risk is direct and uncomfortable. Public health researchers and climate scientists have long warned that climate change, by disrupting agricultural systems, increasing the frequency of extreme weather events, and altering the ranges of disease-carrying insects and rodents, is likely to increase the risk of epidemic disease in the coming century. The 14th century experience suggests that those warnings deserve serious attention, that the interaction between climate stress, nutritional stress, and epidemic disease can produce outcomes that are far worse than the individual risks would suggest, and that the populations most vulnerable to those interactions are those that are already under stress from other causes. The lessons of the Black Death are not simply historical. They are, in this respect, urgently contemporary. The specific mechanism by which climate change affects zoonotic disease risk is one that the Black Death experience illustrates clearly. The warming and drying of the Central Asian steppe in the 1340s, associated with climate variability that disrupted the population cycles of the marmots and rodents that serve as plague reservoirs, may have been one of the triggers that pushed the plague from its animal reservoir into human populations. When rodent populations crash, the fleas that depend on them seek new hosts, increasing contact with humans. Climate fluctuations that alter rodent food abundance directly affect the frequency of these spillover events. As climate change alters the ranges of disease-carrying animals, and as human populations expand into areas where those animals live, spillover frequency is likely to increase. The Black Death was, among other things, a spillover event, the catastrophic result of a pathogen jumping from its animal reservoir to an immunologically naive human population. It was not the last such event, and it will not be the last. The communities that survived the Black Death were not the same communities that had existed before it, and the transformation went deeper than the simple arithmetic of population loss. The experience of watching half one's community die within a few years produced changes in consciousness that the survivors carried for the rest of their lives. Medieval people had lived in a world organized around certainty, the certainty of divine order, of social hierarchy, of the regular progression of seasons and harvests and human generations. The plague shattered that certainty. It killed the righteous as readily as the sinful, the priest as readily as the merchant, the young as readily as the old. It made the future unpredictable in a way that medieval frameworks of meaning could not accommodate. The response was a profound recalibration of what mattered, a shift in values, in priorities, in the way people related to the short time they had. One manifestation of this shift was a new emphasis on the individual and on the quality of individual life in the present. Medieval culture had traditionally deferred to the authority of the church, the community, and the social hierarchy. Individual desires and individual judgment were subordinated to the needs of the community and the requirements of the divine order. The plague undermined that subordination by demonstrating that the institutions, the church, the hierarchy, the community, could not protect the individual from death, and that the divine order, as traditionally understood, was operating in ways that no one could explain. The survivors of the plague were left more on their own, more dependent on their own judgment and their own resources, more aware of the value of the individual life and the individual moment. That shift in consciousness, historians argue, was one of the cultural preconditions for the individualism that characterizes the Renaissance and the early modern period. The shortage of labor also produced, somewhat counterintuitively, an improvement in the average quality of material life for many survivors. With fewer mouths to feed and more land per person, the diet of ordinary Europeans improved in the decades after the Black Death. More meat, more dairy, more variety than had been available to the dense, often malnourished population of the pre-plague era. The wages of craftsmen and laborers rose. The cost of land fell. A peasant who had been unable to afford his own land before the plague might, after it, be able to acquire a holding from which he could build a degree of economic independence. The survivors of the Black Death, paradoxically, often lived better than their parents had. The catastrophe that killed half the population also, by reducing the competition for resources, improved the conditions of those who remained. The archaeological evidence for this improvement in living standards is surprisingly rich. Studies of the skeletal remains of people who died in the decades after the Black Death, compared with the remains of those who died before it, show evidence of better nutrition, higher average height, fewer signs of nutritional deficiency diseases, better dental health. The bodies of the post-plague generation, at least in northwestern Europe, were larger and healthier than those of the pre-plague generation. The diet of ordinary people improved in ways that are documented not only in skeletal remains but in contemporary written sources. Accounts of what ordinary people ate in the late 14th century include more meat, more fish, more varied vegetables than the accounts from the early 14th century, when the dense population and the strains of the Little Ice Age had compressed the diet of the poor to a near-subsistence level of grain and little else. The improvement in material conditions was not universal, and it was not permanent. By the late 15th century, as the population began to recover from the plague losses, the pressure on resources was increasing again, wages were beginning to fall, and the advantages that the plague had inadvertently conferred on the survivors were being eroded by the simple arithmetic of population growth. The cycle of population growth, resource pressure, vulnerability to epidemic disease, and demographic collapse that characterized pre-industrial European history was not broken by the Black Death. It was merely reset. But the reset was dramatic enough to change the social structure of European society in ways that persisted for generations, and the world that emerged from the plague years was measurably different from the world that had entered them. The psychological legacy of having survived the worst, of being the generation that had lost half its world and had continued nonetheless, also left traces. There is something in the cultural production of the late 14th and early 15th centuries, in its combination of memento mori bleakness and extraordinary creative energy, that reflects the consciousness of survivors, people who have seen the worst and have decided, despite it, to build something new. The Decameron, the Canterbury Tales, the flowering of vernacular literature across Europe in the decades after the plague, these are the work of a generation that had been through something terrible and had found, on the other side, the energy and the desire to tell stories about it. The later history of plague in Europe, the long tale of the 14th century pandemic that stretched through the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries, is in some ways as important as the original Black Death for understanding the plague's full impact on European civilization. The Great Plague of London in 1665 is one of the most famous of these later outbreaks, and it illustrates both the continuity of plague in European life and the changes in the institutional and intellectual capacity to respond to it that had developed in the 3 centuries since the Black Death. The 1665 London plague killed approximately 100,000 people, roughly a quarter of the city's population, in the space of about 18 months. The response of London's authorities drew directly on the public health frameworks developed in Italy in the wake of the Black Death: isolation of the sick, quarantine of infected households, closure of public gatherings, recording and publication of mortality statistics. The Bills of Mortality, weekly death records published by the City of London, provided the raw material for John Grunt's natural and political observations upon the Bills of Mortality, published in 1662, which is considered one of the founding documents of demography and statistics as academic disciplines. The plague was thus not only a catastrophe but a stimulus to the development of the quantitative analysis of human populations that would eventually become one of the foundations of modern social science. The Great Plague of Marseille in 1720 was the last major plague outbreak in Western Europe, killing perhaps half the population of Marseille and reaching into Provence before it was contained. The containment was achieved partly through public health measures and partly through a physical barrier, a plague wall, the Mur de la Peste, built across Provence to prevent the disease from spreading further, that represented a determination to stop the plague that previous generations had not possessed the institutional capacity to implement. The wall worked, more or less. After Marseille, plague largely withdrew from Western Europe, though it continued to strike Eastern Europe and the Ottoman Empire into the 19th century, and it persists in animal reservoirs across Asia and the Americas to the present day. The retreat of plague from Western Europe after 1720 has been attributed to several factors: improvements in urban sanitation that reduced rat populations, changes in the dominant rat species from the black rat to the brown rat whose fleas are less effective plague vectors, better public health infrastructure, possibly changes in the virulence of the pathogen itself. The exact relative contributions of these factors remain debated. But the retreat of plague was one of the most important events in European demographic history, removing a check on population growth that had operated for nearly 4 centuries and opening the way for the population explosion of the 18th and 19th centuries that in turn drove industrialization, urbanization, and the transformation of the global economy. The third pandemic of plague, the most recent of the 3 great pandemic waves, began in the Yunnan province of China in the 1850s and spread globally through the maritime trade routes of the 19th century, reaching Hong Kong in 1894, India in 1896, San Francisco in 1900, and establishing endemic reservoirs in rodent populations on every inhabited continent. It was this pandemic that provided the scientific breakthrough that finally explained what the Black Death had been. Alexander Yerson's identification of the plague bacillus in 1894, followed by Paul Louis Simon's demonstration in 1898 that fleas were the primary vector of transmission between rats and humans. These discoveries, coming more than 5 centuries after the Black Death, finally provided the mechanistic understanding that the medieval world had desperately sought and failed to find. They also enabled the development of effective treatments, first serum therapies, then, in the 20th century, antibiotics that can cure plague rapidly if administered early enough. Bubonic plague is now highly treatable. The disease that killed half of Europe in 3 years can today be cured in a week with a course of doxycycline. Plague still exists. Between 1,000 and 2,000 cases of human plague are reported to the World Health Organization each year, primarily in the Democratic Republic of Congo, Madagascar, and Peru. Small numbers of cases occur in the southwestern United States, where the bacterium circulates in prairie dog colonies across the high desert. Every case is a reminder that Yersinia pestis has not disappeared, that it is still out there in the rodent populations of the world's drylands, still waiting for the conjunction of circumstances that allows it to make the jump to humans. The pandemic that killed half of Europe in 3 years was not a historical accident but a biological reality that the modern world has controlled, not eliminated. The San Francisco plague epidemic of 1900 to 1904 illustrates how epidemic disease is always filtered through the social and political frameworks of the society that experiences it. When bubonic plague was identified among San Francisco's Chinese immigrant population in 1900, the city government initially denied its existence, acknowledging plague would have devastated commerce, and when denial became impossible, the quarantine imposed was racially selective. The epidemic eventually established the endemic rodent reservoir that persists in the western United States today. The same intersection of public health concern with racial prejudice visible in San Francisco in 1900 is recognizable in the responses to the Black Death in 1348. The social dynamics of epidemic response have changed less than the science of epidemic disease. Modern science has given us tools to understand the Black Death that would have been incomprehensible to its survivors, tools that have both confirmed the broad outlines of what medieval sources recorded and revealed details that no medieval observer could have known. The ancient DNA analysis of Black Death victims has been one of the most productive applications of archaeogenetics, the study of ancient DNA recovered from archaeological remains, to historical questions. Beginning in the 1990s and accelerating dramatically in the 2010s with improvements in sequencing technology, researchers have recovered and analyzed the genomes of Yersinia pestis from the teeth and bones of plague victims buried in cemeteries across Europe and Central Asia. Those analyses have produced results that are both scientifically fascinating and historically illuminating. The genome of the Black Death bacterium has been fully reconstructed, and it turns out to be remarkably similar to modern strains of Yersinia pestis. The bacterium has changed relatively little in its genetic makeup over the past 7 centuries. Though the strains that cause human plague today are not directly descended from the 14th century pathogen, but represent related lineages that have evolved in parallel from the same Central Asian ancestor. The reconstruction of the ancient genome has confirmed that the Black Death was indeed caused by Yersinia pestis and not by some other pathogen, a question that had been debated, with some scholars arguing that the speed and mortality of the medieval plague were inconsistent with what we know of bubonic plague and suggesting alternative culprits like hemorrhagic fever viruses or anthrax. The ancient DNA evidence has settled that debate. It was plague, caused by the same bacterium that still circulates in rodent populations today. The genetic analysis has also shed light on the question of human evolutionary responses to the plague. Several studies have found evidence that the Black Death exerted significant evolutionary selection pressure on the human immune system, that the genes associated with immune response show signatures of positive selection in European populations that are consistent with the plague having killed disproportionately those with certain immune variants. The specific variants that appear to have been selected for by the plague include genes in the immune system pathway that is also involved in the body's response to HIV, a finding that may help explain why European populations show a higher frequency of certain HIV resistance alleles than other populations, a pattern that has puzzled geneticists since it was first observed. The Black Death, according to this hypothesis, not only reshaped European civilization but left a permanent mark on the European genome, changing the distribution of immune variants in the population in ways that are still detectable today, 7 centuries later. The ancient DNA research has also produced a remarkable convergence between the scientific and historical evidence for the origins and spread of the Black Death. Before the genetic work began in earnest in the 2010s, there were historians who questioned whether the medieval plague was truly caused by Yersinia pestis at all, who argued that the mortality rates and the speed of spread were inconsistent with what modern epidemiology knew of bubonic plague, and who proposed alternative candidates: hemorrhagic fever viruses, anthrax, even some unknown pathogen that no longer exists. The ancient DNA evidence has definitively resolved that debate. Yersinia pestis DNA has been found in plague victims buried across Europe, from England to Russia, from Norway to the Balkans, all consistent with a single ancestral strain that entered Europe in the mid-14th century and swept across the continent in the years that followed. The medieval chroniclers who described the symptoms of the plague, the buboes, the darkened skin, the rapid death, were describing something real, something caused by a bacterium whose genome we can now read directly from the teeth of its victims. The reconstruction of the Black Death bacterium's genome has also revealed something unexpected. The 14th century strain was, in some respects, more virulent than modern strains of Yersinia pestis. Specific genetic features that appear to enhance the bacterium's ability to survive in the human bloodstream and to suppress the immune response are present in the Black Death genome in configurations that differ from those found in modern strains. Whether those genetic differences explain the extraordinary mortality of the Black Death, why it killed so much more efficiently than modern plague outbreaks, is a question that researchers are actively investigating. The answer, when it comes, will have implications not only for understanding the past, but for preparing for the possibility that Yersinia pestis or another zoonotic pathogen could, under the right conditions, make the transition from animal reservoir to human pandemic with similar devastating efficiency. The ancient DNA work has also provided insights into mortality patterns that historical sources cannot reveal. By comparing the genetic profiles of plague victims with those of the pre-plague population, researchers are building a picture of who the plague killed and how selection operated. Early results suggest the plague did not kill purely randomly. That certain individuals, perhaps those with particular immune variants, were somewhat more likely to survive. The magnitude of this differential survival is still being assessed, but the existence of some biological variation in susceptibility is becoming clearer with each new analysis, and its implications for understanding the long-term evolutionary impact of the plague on European populations are significant. The psychological legacy of the Black Death, what it did to the minds of those who survived it, and how those effects propagated through subsequent generations, is one of the most difficult aspects of the plague to assess, because the inner life of medieval people is accessible only through fragmentary and often highly conventionalized documentary sources. What the documents do reveal is a society under extreme stress, a society in which the normal mechanisms for coping with loss and fear had been overwhelmed by the scale of the disaster. The medieval tradition of ars moriendi, the art of dying well, the elaborate spiritual preparation for death that the Church prescribed for the dying Christian, assumed a death that came gradually enough to permit preparation, with clergy present to administer last rites and family present to witness the final moments. The plague death denied all of this. It came suddenly. In many cases it prevented the administration of last rites because the clergy were themselves dead or fled, and the sheer numbers of the dying made individual attention impossible. The consequence was a fear of dying badly, without sacrament, without preparation, in spiritual as well as physical uncleanness, that was superimposed on the already overwhelming fear of dying at all. Medieval writers described the psychological effects of the plague with remarkable directness. The abandonment of the normal bonds of charity and mutual aid, parents fleeing children, children fleeing parents, neighbors barring their doors against the sick, was recorded by chroniclers as evidence of the plague's power to destroy the social fabric. Boccaccio described Florentines who had adopted the philosophy that the best protection was to eat and drink well, enjoy oneself, and refuse any association with the sick, an Epicurean response to mortality that represented a sharp break from the self-denial and communal obligation that Christian morality prescribed. Others had gone to the opposite extreme, excessive piety, obsessive prayer and fasting, in an attempt to appease the divine anger. And others still had simply abandoned hope and all restraint, behaving as though the world were ending and conventional morality no longer applied. The trauma of the Black Death was not resolved when the plague receded. It was carried forward in the memory of individuals and communities, encoded in the obsessive death imagery of late medieval art, in the recurring anxiety about plague recurrence that shaped urban public health policy for centuries, and in the religious and philosophical movements that sought to rebuild a framework of meaning adequate to a world in which half the people one had known could die in 3 years. The long cultural shadow of the Black Death, the ways in which the experience of catastrophic mass mortality shaped European attitudes toward death, religion, authority, and individual life, is one of the most important and most difficult to measure of all the plague's legacies. The long retreat of plague from Western Europe has sometimes encouraged a complacency about the disease that the biology does not warrant. Yersinia pestis is still present in the rodent populations of the American Southwest, Central Asia, and Africa. Between 1,000 and 2,000 cases are reported to the World Health Organization each year. A medieval physician confronted with a bubo had nothing useful to offer. A modern physician can cure the same infection in days with doxycycline. That difference is the product of 5 centuries of accumulated scientific knowledge, beginning with the careful observation of medieval epidemic chroniclers and culminating in the germ theory and the antibiotic revolution. The Black Death did not just kill half of Europe. Through the desperate attempts to understand and control it, it set in motion some of the processes that eventually gave humanity the tools to fight infectious disease more effectively than any previous generation. The will-writing practices of medieval Europeans provide one measurable indicator of how the plague changed behavior. In the years of the Black Death, notaries across Italy were overwhelmed with requests to draw up wills. People who had never bothered to formalize their testamentary intentions were suddenly anxious to do so. Many wills were drawn up in great haste, with unusual arrangements reflecting the chaos of the moment. Donations to religious institutions intended to purchase prayers for souls that might not have time to do proper penance, arrangements for children that assumed parents might die before the children grew up. The wills of the plague years are archives of private fear. The reconfiguration of family and community relationships in the aftermath of the plague is another psychological legacy that is documented in the sources, though incompletely. Families that had lost parents needed to reconstitute themselves around surviving relatives. Children who had lost both parents might be absorbed into the households of surviving uncles, aunts, or grandparents, or might be placed in the care of institutions like the orphanages that began to appear across Italian cities in the post-plague period. Communities that had lost a significant portion of their members needed to absorb migrants from other areas. There are records of deliberate efforts to attract settlers to depopulated villages and towns by offering favorable terms. The social fabric that the plague had shredded was rewoven, over the following decades, from the survivors and their descendants, and the communities that emerged from that reweaving were in many ways different from those that had entered the catastrophe. The Black Death raises questions that are not only historical but profoundly contemporary. Questions about how societies respond to sudden, catastrophic epidemics, about the relationship between disease and social inequality, and about what we can learn from the past about the challenges we face in the present. The parallels between the Black Death and the COVID-19 pandemic of the 21st century were noted almost immediately when COVID-19 emerged in 2020. In both cases, a novel pathogen spread rapidly across a connected world, overwhelming the public health capacity of affected societies, producing emergency measures that disrupted normal economic and social life, and generating both genuine heroism and extraordinary failures of solidarity and governance. The specific diseases are very different. COVID-19 is caused by a coronavirus, not a bacterium, and its mortality rate, while significant, is nothing like the 50% mortality of the medieval plague, but the structural similarities in the social responses are striking. The debates about quarantine and isolation, about the appropriate balance between economic activity and disease control, about who bears the burden of epidemic response and who is protected from it, these are debates that medieval societies had, in their own terms, and that modern societies have had again in circumstances that are both vastly different and recognizably similar. The relationship between plague and social inequality is another contemporary resonance. The Black Death killed across all social classes. No rank or wealth provided reliable protection against a flea bite, but its effects were not socially neutral. The poor lived in more crowded conditions, had less access to food and clean water, had weaker immune systems from chronic malnutrition, and had fewer resources to flee to less densely populated areas. The rich could retreat to country houses. The poor could not. The rich could afford doctors and medicines. The poor could not. The differential vulnerability to epidemic disease that was visible in the Black Death is visible in every subsequent epidemic, including the most recent ones, where the burden of disease has fallen disproportionately on the poor, the crowded, the malnourished, and those without access to health care. The Black Death also transformed the relationship between governments and the health of their populations in ways that resonate today. The public health institutions that emerged in response to the plague, the quarantine systems, the boards of health, the hospitals for the sick, represented a new claim by governments on the bodies of their subjects, a new assertion that the state had both the right and the responsibility to intervene in the lives of individuals in order to protect the health of the community. That claim has been contested, extended, and refined over the past 7 centuries, but it has never been abandoned. The modern public health infrastructure, the departments of health, the disease surveillance systems, the vaccination programs, the epidemic response protocols, is built on foundations that were laid, in the most urgent circumstances imaginable, in the Italian city-states of the mid-14th century by administrators trying to stop a disease that was killing half their citizens. The social inequality that shapes epidemic vulnerability is another contemporary resonance of the Black Death experience. Modern studies of COVID-19 mortality found that the disease killed disproportionately in crowded, low-income neighborhoods, among people with preconditions related to poor nutrition and inadequate health care, among essential workers who could not work remotely and therefore could not reduce their exposure through isolation. The Black Death, though it killed across all social classes, also showed this differential vulnerability. The urban poor, living in the most crowded conditions and with the least access to adequate nutrition and clean water, were almost certainly more severely affected than the wealthy, who could retreat to country estates and who had the physical reserves to mount a stronger immune response. The structural determinants of health, income, housing, nutrition, access to medical care, are not modern inventions. They have shaped the distribution of disease throughout human history, and the plague is among the most dramatic historical examples of that shaping. The contemporary resonance extends to the psychology of pandemic response. The debates that raged in medieval cities about whether to close markets, restrict travel, or quarantine the sick, debates between those who prioritized public health and those who prioritized economic activity and personal freedom, are recognizably the same debates that have recurred in every subsequent epidemic, including the most recent ones. The tension between individual liberty and collective welfare, between the economic costs of epidemic control and the human costs of epidemic spread, has no easy resolution in any era. What the Black Death experience suggests is that the societies that responded most effectively were those that developed institutional capacity to implement quarantine and isolation measures quickly and consistently, and that the failure to do so in the early stages of an epidemic, when the disease is still localized enough to contain, tends to produce much larger losses than any economic disruption that the containment measures might cause. The Black Death was not the end of anything. Not of medieval civilization, not of the Catholic Church, not of the feudal system, not of European life. All of those things survived, transformed but intact. What the plague ended was a particular relationship between the European population and its world, a relationship of relative stability, of confidence in the established order, of faith in the sufficiency of the frameworks that had organized European life for centuries. The world that emerged from the Black Death was a different world, not unrecognizable, but changed in its proportions and its priorities. It was a world with more land per person and higher wages for labor. It was a world in which the authority of the Church had been weakened by the plague's demonstration that prayer and penance could not stop the dying, and in which the authority of secular governments had been tested and in many cases found wanting. It was a world in which the memory of mass death was freshly present, in which the skull beneath the skin was not a distant abstraction but a recent experience, and in which that memory had changed the way people thought about time, about pleasure, about the value of the individual life. It was a world that had been forced, by circumstances of the most brutal kind, to reckon with the fragility of everything it had taken for granted. In that reckoning, The Black Death planted seeds that would take generations to flower. The questioning of established authority that the plague had made inevitable contributed, over the following century, to the intellectual ferment of the Renaissance, to the rediscovery of classical philosophy and literature, to the development of humanism, to the new emphasis on empirical observation rather than received authority. The crisis of faith that the plague had produced within the Church contributed, over the following 2 centuries, to the Reformation, to the challenge of papal authority, the translation of Scripture into vernacular languages, the reorganization of European Christianity into competing confessions. The social and economic disruptions of the plague years contributed, over the following century, to the transformation of the feudal system and the emergence of the economic forms that would eventually develop into capitalism. None of these developments was caused by the Black Death alone. History is never that simple, and the currents that produced the Renaissance, the Reformation, and the transformation of the European economy were already flowing before the plague arrived. What the plague did was change the rate of flow, accelerating some currents, damming others, opening new channels that had been blocked by the institutional inertia of the pre-plague world. There is a school of historical thought that views the Black Death as, in the long run, a net positive for European civilization, a catastrophe that cleared the way for modernity. That view is not without foundation. The improvements in living standards, the intellectual questioning of established authority, the development of public health institutions, these are genuine legacies that contributed to the world we inhabit. But the view is also deeply uncomfortable, because it requires treating the deaths of 50 million people as the acceptable price of historical progress. Those 50 million people did not experience the plague as progress. They experienced it as the death of their parents and their children and their neighbors, as the collapse of the world they had known. The historian's task is to hold both of these realities simultaneously, to recognize the genuine long-term consequences of the plague for the development of European and ultimately global civilization, and to refuse to allow that recognition to diminish the horror of what the plague actually was: the death, in 3 years, of half the people alive in Europe. Every one of those people was a specific individual with a specific life, a specific childhood, a specific set of relationships, a specific understanding of who they were and what the world was. The plague ended all of those lives. The world that came after was different, and in some respects better, than the world that had preceded it. But the difference was purchased at a cost that no historical narrative can fully account for. But the Black Death accelerated and intensified those currents, by destroying the population and the institutions that might have maintained the status quo, by creating conditions of scarcity and uncertainty that made existing frameworks harder to defend, and by producing a generation of survivors who had experienced the worst that the world could do to them and had come out the other side with a different understanding of what mattered and what did not. The ships that arrived in Messina in the autumn of 1347 carried something that would kill half the people who were then alive in Europe. They also carried, in the disruption and the transformation they set in motion, the conditions for the world that came after, a world that had been broken and rebuilt, that had lost half of everything it knew and had found, in the ruins, new ways of thinking about what it meant to be alive. The Black Death is not only a story of death. It is also, in the deepest sense, a story of survival, of the extraordinary resilience of human communities, and of the ways in which even the most catastrophic losses can become the foundation for something new. If this documentary kept you company tonight, subscribe to the channel. There are more moments when the world changed entirely, more catastrophes that became transformations, more disasters that remade everything they touched. A new documentary every week, always in the hours designed for rest, always going further than you expect.